My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior cryptanalyst for a private cybersecurity firm. My entire profession is dedicated to the science of decryption. I spend my days staring at intercepted communications, looking for patterns, isolating the signal from the noise, and breaking the encryption keys that people use to hide their most damaging secrets. In cryptography, you learn a very simple, universal rule about human communication. If people are speaking in a code you cannot understand, it is because they are discussing something they plan to steal from you. So, when I sat at the center of my mother-in-law's lavish dining room table for the 42nd consecutive Sunday family dinner, listening to my husband and his entire family speak rapidly and exclusively in a language I supposedly did not understand, I did not cry. I did not look down at my plate in humiliation. I did not beg my husband to translate for me. I simply took a slow sip of my red wine, smiled politely, and listened. My husband, Lucas, was sitting across from me, laughing loudly at a joke his mother had just told. He believed that I was sitting in absolute, ignorant isolation. He believed that the foreign syllables bouncing across the crystal wine glasses were completely incomprehensible to me. He believed that for 3 entire years, his family had successfully used their native tongue as an impenetrable fortress to mock me, to isolate me, and to plot against me right to my face. He was wrong. He was catastrophically wrong. Because for the last 3 years, while he thought I was listening to music on my daily commute, I had been listening to intensive language tapes. While he thought I was at the gym, I was sitting in a soundproof room with a private, immersive tutor. And on that particular Sunday, as my mother-in-law smiled at me and delivered a brutal, venomous insult in her native language, she did not know that I understood every single word. Welcome back to Family Drama Files, where we tell quiet, true-to-life stories about deep betrayal, methodical justice, and the exact moment someone stops shrinking to accommodate the toxic, cowardly people in their lives. If you have ever been intentionally excluded, mocked in plain sight, or treated like an outsider in your own marriage, this story is for you. Drop a comment below to let me know where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. To understand the absolute, suffocating psychological warfare of what I endured at that dining table, you have to understand the architecture of my marriage to Lucas, and the weaponization of the Greek language by his mother, Katerina. I met Lucas when I was 27 years old. He was a corporate architect, charming, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a warm, magnetic energy that immediately drew me in. When we first started dating, he was the perfect partner. He was attentive. He asked me about my complex career in cybersecurity, and he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. But there was a catch, and her name was Katerina. Lucas was a first-generation Greek-American. His family was incredibly wealthy, having built a massive commercial real estate empire in the city. Katerina was the undisputed matriarch of the family. She was a woman who demanded absolute loyalty, absolute obedience, and total assimilation into her specific way of life. When Lucas first introduced me to his family, I knew instantly that I was a disappointment. I was not Greek. I was a quiet, analytical woman who preferred reading algorithms over attending loud, boisterous social galas. I did not fit the mold of the compliant, traditional daughter-in-law Katerina had envisioned for her golden son. During that very first dinner, Katerina looked at my modest dress, asked what I did for a living, and when I explained my job as a cryptanalyst, she gave a thin, dismissive smile. She turned to Lucas, switched instantly from English to Greek, and spoke rapidly for 2 full minutes. Lucas laughed nervously, looked at me with a slight wince, and replied to her in English. "Mom says it is a very unique job for a woman," Lucas translated, patting my hand. I knew it was a sanitized translation. I could read the sharp, condescending tone in Katerina's voice and the smirk on the faces of Lucas's 2 older sisters, Eleni and Sophia. But I was in love with Lucas, and I wanted to make a good impression, so I smiled and let it go. I assumed that the language barrier was simply a temporary hurdle. I assumed that, over time, as I became a permanent fixture in Lucas's life, they would naturally revert to English when I was in the room to include me in the family dynamic. I was profoundly naive. We got married a year later in a massive, extravagant wedding that Katerina entirely hijacked and paid for. I allowed it because Lucas begged me to keep the peace. "It is just how my culture is, Maya," he would say, kissing my forehead. "Family is everything. Just let my mother have her way." It makes her happy, and it makes my life easier. It makes my life easier. That was Lucas's entire operational philosophy. He would rather subject his wife to a lifetime of disrespect than endure 5 minutes of his mother's displeasure. The moment we returned from our honeymoon, the true isolation began. Every single Sunday, attendance at Katerina's massive estate for a family dinner was mandatory. Lucas, his sisters, their husbands, and various extended relatives would gather around a massive oak dining table. And the moment the front door closed behind us, the English language ceased to exist. For 3 to 4 hours every Sunday, I sat in a room with 12 people who refused to speak a language I could understand. It was not a matter of comfort or slipping accidentally into their mother tongue. It was a deliberate, weaponized exclusion. If I asked a direct question in English to Lucas's sister, Eleni, she would look at me, give a brief, one-word answer in English, and immediately turn to the person next to her and launch into a loud, animated story in Greek. I would sit there, staring at my plate, picking at my roasted lamb, listening to the roaring laughter, the heated debates, and the shared inside jokes, completely invisible. I was a ghost haunting my own marriage. When we drove home in the car on Sunday nights, I would try to talk to Lucas about how deeply it hurt me. Lucas, I would say, my voice thick with unshed tears. I sat there for 3 hours today and no one spoke to me. They talked right over me. It feels incredibly disrespectful. Can you please ask them to speak English when we are all at the table? Lucas would grip the steering wheel, sigh heavily, and deploy his classic gaslighting defense. Maya, you are being overly sensitive, he would say, his tone dripping with patronizing exhaustion. They are not doing it to hurt you. It is their native language. It is how they express themselves best. You cannot expect my elderly parents to change their entire cultural dynamic just because you feel a little left out. You just need to make more of an effort to fit in. I stared at him from the passenger seat. I was the one expected to make an effort, while 12 people actively pretended I was deaf and mute. I tried. I really tried. I asked Lucas to teach me some basic phrases. He laughed it off, saying Greek was too difficult for an English speaker to pick up casually, and he did not have the time to be a teacher. The breaking point occurred exactly 8 months into our marriage. It was a Sunday evening. We were at the dining table. I was feeling particularly exhausted from a brutal week at the cybersecurity firm. Katerina was holding court at the head of the table. She looked directly at me, her eyes sweeping over the dark circles under my eyes and my simple blouse. She turned to Lucas and spoke a long, rapid sentence in Greek. Her tone was sharp, mocking, and ended with a word that sounded remarkably harsh. Eleni and Sophia burst into cruel, ringing laughter. The husbands chuckled. Lucas's face flushed a deep red. He looked at his plate, smiled a tight, uncomfortable smile, and gave a short, quiet reply in Greek. He did not defend me. He joined the laughter. I felt a cold stone drop in my stomach. I reached under the table and put my hand on Lucas's knee. What did she say, Lucas? I asked quietly. Lucas jumped slightly. He looked at me, his eyes darting away instantly. Oh, nothing, Maya. My mother was just saying that you look very tired from your job. She worries that you work too hard. It was a lie. I am a cryptanalyst. I analyze human behavior and deception for a living. The micro-expressions on his face, the averted gaze, the sudden flush, the rigid posture, were the textbook indicators of a man who was actively covering up a vicious insult. His mother had humiliated me in front of the entire family. And my husband, the man who stood at an altar and promised to protect me, had laughed. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine glass across the room. I did not stand up and storm out of the house. When a cryptanalyst discovers that the enemy is transmitting hostile codes on an open frequency, you do not jam the signal. You do not alert the enemy that you know they are broadcasting. If you do that, they will simply change the encryption key and you will be locked out again in the dark. Instead, you sit in the silence. You record the signal, and you learn how to break the code. I smiled politely at Katerina. Tell your mother I appreciate her concern for my health, I said to Lucas. The next morning, while Lucas was at his architectural firm, I executed the first phase of my infiltration. I did not download a cheap, gamified language app on my phone. An app would not teach me the rapid-fire, colloquial, highly contextual dialect his family spoke. I needed military-grade immersion. I contacted a university linguistics department in the city. I found a graduate student, a native Greek speaker who was studying translation and dialectology. I offered her a premium, exorbitant hourly rate under a strict non-disclosure agreement. I told Lucas that my firm had assigned me to a new, highly classified project that required me to stay late at the office 3 days a week and work isolated in my home office on the weekends. Because my job dealt with national security contractors, Lucas never questioned my hours. He liked the prestige of my job, even if his mother did not. In reality, those extra hours were spent in a soundproof rented office space across the city, sitting across from my tutor, Elena. For the first 6 months, it was pure agony. The Greek alphabet is entirely different. The grammar rules are complex. The syntax is punishing. But I approached it not as a student learning a romantic language for a vacation, but as an intelligence officer breaking a hostile cipher. I recorded the audio of the Sunday dinners on a hidden dictaphone in my purse. I would bring the audio files to Elena on Monday evenings. "Translate this," I would say, playing the muffled, chaotic recordings of Katerina holding court. Elena would listen, her eyebrows raising in shock at the vitriol she heard. She would break down the sentences, teaching me the exact slang, the regional idioms, and the specific cadence Katerina used. It took me an entire year before I could catch complete sentences in real time. It took me 2 years before I could understand the rapid, overlapping arguments between Lucas and his sisters. And by the beginning of the 3rd year, I was completely, flawlessly fluent in comprehension. I could listen to a crowded room of 12 people speaking simultaneously, and I could isolate every single conversation. The psychological toll of sitting at that Sunday dinner table during those 3 years is difficult to articulate. Imagine sitting in a room with the people you consider your family, and slowly, week by week, the static noise resolves into crystal-clear audio. And the audio is nothing but pure, unadulterated poison. I heard Katerina mock my weight. I heard Eleni criticize my clothes, calling me a bland American peasant. I heard them mock my parents, who lived in a different state in a modest middle-class home. But the most devastating part was not the women. The most devastating part was Lucas. I heard my husband, the man who kissed me every morning and told me I was the love of his life, actively agree with his mother's cruelty. I heard him complain that I was too independent. I heard him tell his sisters that he only married me because I was low maintenance and had a high income, which allowed him to invest his own money without me asking questions. I sat there, eating my roasted lamb, smiling my polite, vacant smile, while my husband tore my character to shreds in front of an audience, entirely confident in his encrypted fortress. I was gathering massive amounts of intelligence. I knew exactly what they thought of me. But insults, while painful, are not illegal. If I simply stood up and revealed I spoke the language, they would be momentarily embarrassed, but they would immediately gaslight me, call me a psychotic spy, and Lucas would try to spin it as a misunderstanding. I needed actionable intelligence. I needed a reason to detonate the bomb that would leave absolute, undeniable ruin in its wake. I found that reason in the autumn of our 3rd year of marriage. It was the 2nd Sunday in November. The air outside was turning bitterly cold, but inside Katerina's massive dining room, the atmosphere was thick with roasted meat, heavy wine, and the usual rapid-fire Greek conversation. I was sitting in my customary seat, positioned near the middle of the long oak table, picking at a piece of spanakopita. By this point, my fluency was absolute. My brain no longer had to translate the Greek syllables into English. I simply understood the language natively. I was a human recording device, sitting in plain sight, entirely invisible. The conversation at the far end of the table had shifted away from the usual petty gossip about extended relatives and zeroed in on my husband, Lucas, and his older sister, Eleni. Eleni's husband, a greasy commercial real estate developer named Kostas, leaned forward, stabbing his fork into the air for emphasis. "The deadline is approaching, Lucas," Kostas said in rapid, hushed Greek, glancing nervously down the table at me before continuing. "The zoning board is demanding the environmental impact fee by the end of the month. If we do not wire the $250,000, they will pull the permits on the downtown high-rise project. We will lose millions." Lucas rubbed his temples, looking visibly stressed. He took a long drink of his red wine. "I know, Kostas," Lucas replied in Greek, his voice tight. "I am trying to move the capital. But my personal liquid assets are tied up in the suburban subdivision build. I do not have $250,000 in cash just sitting around." Katerina, sitting at the head of the table like a monarch overseeing her generals, scoffed loudly. She waved a dismissive hand covered in heavy gold rings. "Do not be stupid, Lucas," Katerina sneered in Greek, rolling her eyes. "You do not need to use your own money. Use the joint account. The American works like a dog. She just got that massive bonus from her cybersecurity firm, did she not? Pull the money from there." My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. I kept my face perfectly blank. I slowly brought my wine glass to my lips, obscuring my mouth, and took a sip. The American. That was her favorite name for me. "Mother, I cannot just withdraw $250,000 from our joint savings account," Lucas whispered fiercely in Greek, leaning closer to Katerina to ensure his voice did not carry over the music playing in the background. "Maya monitors our finances closely. If she sees a wire transfer that large going to Kostas's development firm, she will ask questions. She is an analyst. She tracks money for a living." Eleni laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Oh please, you are a man, Lucas, act like one. You control the household. Just tell her it is a secure investment for your retirement." "She will not believe that," Lucas argued, his frustration mounting. "She insisted on a separate prenuptial agreement for our primary incomes. The joint account is strictly for household expenses and our mutual future down payment on a house. If I drain it, it is legally considered marital theft." I sat perfectly still. He was right. Before we got married, the only boundary I successfully enforced against Katerina's pressure was a prenuptial agreement protecting my high corporate salary and my premarital assets. We maintained one joint savings account, into which we both deposited 50% of our monthly income, earmarked specifically for buying a home. The balance of that account currently sat at exactly $280,000. "Then you bypass the joint account directly," Kostas interjected smoothly in Greek, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "You do not wire it to my firm. You forge her signature on a withdrawal slip, move the money into a new single-owner offshore shell account in the Caymans, and from there, you invest it into the high-rise project as an anonymous backer. By the time she notices the joint account is empty, the high-rise will be built, we will refinance, and you can put the money back before tax season. It is a temporary loan from a clueless wife." I felt a cold, terrifying absolute clarity wash over my entire nervous system. They were sitting not 3 feet away from me, loudly and openly discussing a conspiracy to commit felony wire fraud, marital asset theft, and money laundering. They were doing it because they believed I was too stupid, too linguistically isolated, to understand a single word. Lucas hesitated. He looked at his wine glass. He looked at Kostas. Then he looked down the table directly at me. I immediately softened my eyes, offering him a sweet, blank, loving smile. Lucas smiled back, a tight, artificial grimace, and turned his attention back to his brother-in-law. "Fine," Lucas said in Greek, sealing his own destruction. "Send me the routing numbers for the Cayman Shell Company tomorrow morning. I will execute the withdrawal on Thursday when she is traveling for her cyber conference in Chicago. She will not check the banking app while she is presenting." "Good boy," Katerina praised him in Greek, reaching over to pat his cheek. "Family protects family, Lucas. The American is temporary, the real estate empire is forever." The conversation shifted to the quality of the roasted potatoes. I finished my dinner. I ate every single bite of my food. I participated in small talk in English whenever someone deigned to translate a sanitized, fake version of a joke for me. I played the role of the docile, ignorant wife flawlessly until we said our goodbyes and got into the car to drive home. The silence in the car was heavy. Lucas drove, his jaw tight, his mind clearly racing with the logistics of the felony he was planning to commit on Thursday. "Did you have a good time tonight, honey?" Lucas asked, attempting to sound casual, keeping his eyes on the road. "It was lovely, Lucas," I said, looking out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. "Your mother's cooking is always incredible." "Yeah," he murmured distractedly. "Yeah, it is." When we got home, I waited until Lucas fell asleep. I quietly slipped out of bed, took my laptop into my home office and locked the door. I did not panic. I am a cryptanalyst. When you uncover an enemy plot to steal data, you do not immediately shut down the server. You set up a honeypot. You let them enter the system, you let them execute the theft, and you record the digital fingerprints so the evidence is absolutely, legally undeniable. I logged into our joint banking portal. I did not move the money. If I moved the money, Lucas would panic, the theft would not occur, and he would simply gaslight me, claiming he never intended to touch it. I needed him to pull the trigger. Instead, I set up a silent, highly sophisticated digital tripwire. I programmed the banking application to immediately alert my private, encrypted work server the exact second a withdrawal exceeding $10,000 was initiated. Furthermore, I contacted the fraud department of the bank, where I had professional contacts through my cybersecurity firm, and requested a mandatory secondary authorization protocol for any outgoing international wires. If Lucas tried to move the money to the Caymans, the bank would silently hold the funds in a processing escrow for 48 hours, giving me the exact window I needed to freeze the transaction legally without tipping him off. On Wednesday evening, I packed my suitcase for my conference in Chicago. Lucas was overly attentive, making me dinner, pouring my wine, acting like the perfect, supportive husband. It was nauseating to watch him perform, knowing he was planning to rob me blind the next morning. "Have a great trip, Maya," Lucas said Thursday morning, kissing me at the front door before I left for the airport. "Knock them dead at the conference. I love you." "I love you too, Lucas," I replied, smiling brightly. I did not go to the airport. I drove my car directly to the underground parking garage of a high-end corporate law firm in the financial district. I had scheduled an emergency meeting with a senior litigator named Evelyn. Evelyn specialized in high-net-worth divorces and corporate asset recovery. She was a woman who wore pristine white suits and possessed the warmth of a great white shark. I sat in Evelyn's glass-walled office, overlooking the city skyline, and laid out the entire situation. I did not sound like a grieving, betrayed wife. I sounded like an intelligence officer delivering a briefing. "My husband is executing a wire transfer of $250,000 from our joint marital account today," I told Evelyn, sliding a printed dossier across her desk. "He is attempting to launder the funds through a Cayman shell company to fund a commercial high-rise project managed by his brother-in-law. I have the routing numbers they plan to use, which I intercepted. I need you to draft an emergency expart freezing order on all of his personal and business accounts, citing imminent dissipation of marital assets and wire fraud." Evelyn opened the dossier. She raised an elegant, perfectly arched eyebrow. "You intercepted the routing numbers. Maya, please tell me you did not illegally wiretap your husband. I cannot use fruit of the poisonous tree in court." "I did not wiretap him, Evelyn," I smiled coldly. "I simply sat at the dinner table and listened to him say the numbers out loud." Evelyn looked confused. "He told you his laundering strategy." "He told his brother-in-law," I clarified, in Greek. "They are under the profound delusion that I do not speak the language. I have been secretly fluent for 3 years." Evelyn stopped reading. She looked up at me, a slow, terrifying, deeply appreciative smile spreading across her face. "Oh, my dear, that is spectacular. We are going to destroy him." At exactly 11:15 a.m., my phone buzzed on Evelyn's desk. It was the silent digital tripwire. "Alert, outgoing international wire transfer initiated. Amount, $250,000. Destination, Grand Cayman." "He just pulled the trigger," I said, turning the phone screen toward Evelyn. Evelyn picked up her desk phone and dialed the presiding family court judge's emergency clerk. Because I had the digital proof of the transaction in progress, paired with my professional credentials and the prenuptial agreement, the judge granted the emergency expart freezing order within 2 hours. By 2 p.m. on Thursday, every single financial asset Lucas possessed, his personal checking accounts, his business operating accounts for his architectural firm, and his credit cards, were legally frozen pending a full fraud investigation. The $250,000 wire transfer was intercepted and locked in the bank's fraud escrow. Lucas was completely, utterly bankrupt, and he did not even know it yet. "Now," Evelyn said, leaning back in her leather chair and steepling her fingers, "we have secured the assets. How do you want to serve him the divorce papers?" I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. I thought about Katerina. I thought about the 3 years of sitting at that massive oak table, swallowing my pride, listening to a family tear my character to shreds while eating the food I brought to their house. I did not want to serve Lucas in a private office. I did not want to serve him quietly at home. "Evelyn," I said, turning back to the lawyer, "does your firm employ private process servers?" "The best in the city," she confirmed. "Good," I said, Because the entire family is gathering for their mandatory Sunday dinner at Katerina's estate this weekend, and I believe it is time I finally participated in the conversation. For the next 3 days, I stayed in a luxury hotel downtown, officially in Chicago, according to my husband. I did not answer his phone calls. I texted him occasionally, saying the conference was incredibly busy and the reception in the lecture halls was poor. Lucas was frantic. The digital logs from the bank showed that he had attempted to log into his personal accounts 36 times on Friday. He had realized his credit cards were declining. He had realized his business accounts were locked. But because it was a court-ordered freeze, the bank tellers were legally prohibited from telling him anything other than your accounts are under review. He was drowning in panic, assuming he had triggered a random IRS audit or a banking error. He had absolutely no idea that the call was coming from inside the house. Sunday evening arrived. It was raining, a cold, miserable downpour that matched the bleakness of the trap I was about to spring. I dressed meticulously. I did not wear the modest, unassuming blouses I usually wore to Katerina's house. I wore a tailored, crimson-red sheath dress, sharp black stilettos, and an immaculate trench coat. I looked like a woman who commanded rooms for a living. I drove to the massive, gated estate in the suburbs. I parked my car on the street, not in the driveway. I wanted a clean exit. I walked up the long stone pathway to the heavy oak front doors. I did not knock. I still had my key. I unlocked the door and stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled of roasting garlic, lamb, and expensive perfume. From the dining room down the hall, I could hear the familiar, chaotic roar of 12 people arguing, laughing, and talking over one another in rapid Greek. I took off my trench coat, draped it over the entryway table, and walked slowly toward the dining room archway. I stood in the shadows just outside the room and listened. The conversation was not lighthearted tonight. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Lucas was sitting in his usual spot, looking exhausted, his hair disheveled. He was nursing a large glass of scotch, not wine. Kostas, the greasy brother-in-law, was leaning over the table, his face red with anger, shouting at Lucas in Greek. "What do you mean the transfer did not clear?" Kostas demanded in Greek, slamming his hand on the table. "The zoning board deadline is tomorrow morning, Lucas. If that money is not in the Cayman account by 9 o'clock, they pull the permits. You promised me." "I do not know what happened, Kostas," Lucas yelled back in Greek, running a frantic hand through his hair. "The bank locked all of my accounts. Everything is frozen. The tellers will not tell me anything. I think the IRS flagged the international wire transfer as suspicious." Katerina slammed her heavy silver fork against her plate. The sharp clink silenced the arguing men. "You are a fool, Lucas," Katerina hissed in Greek, her eyes burning with disappointment. "I told you to move the money in smaller increments. You triggered a federal algorithm. If the American finds out the joint account is locked, she will start digging. Where is she? Did you speak to her today?" "She is still in Chicago," Lucas groaned in Greek, staring at his scotch glass. "She lands late tonight. I am going to have to lie to her. I will tell her there was an identity theft issue and the bank froze the accounts to protect us." Eleni, Lucas's older sister, laughed cruelly. "She is so stupid. She will probably believe you and thank you for protecting her money. Just keep her distracted until Kostas can bribe someone at the bank to unfreeze the wire." I had heard enough. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and directly into the brilliant, chandelier-lit dining room. "She is not in Chicago, Eleni," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with absolute chilling clarity. But I did not say it in English. I said it in flawless, unaccented, perfect Greek. The silence that slammed into the dining room was not just quiet, it was a physical force. It was the kind of absolute, vacuum-sealed silence that follows a bomb detonation, right before the shockwave hits. 12 people froze entirely. Kostas's hand stopped midair, his finger still pointing at Lucas. Eleni's mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in her teeth. Katerina, the grand, untouchable matriarch, gripped the edges of the heavy oak table so hard her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. But the most spectacular reaction belonged to my husband. Lucas looked as though someone had just injected ice water directly into his veins. The color drained from his face from the top down, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His eyes darted from me, to his mother, to his brother-in-law, and back to me, his brain desperately trying to process a reality that simply could not exist. He had spent 3 entire years treating me like a deaf, ignorant accessory. And in exactly 7 Greek words, I had just fundamentally obliterated the entire architecture of his life. Maya, Lucas choked out in English. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. You spoke Greek? I walked slowly into the room, my crimson dress moving like liquid fire under the crystal chandeliers. I did not break eye contact with him. I do not just speak Greek, Lucas, I replied, seamlessly switching back to their native tongue, ensuring every single person at the table felt the full weight of my fluency. I understand it, I comprehend it. I have comprehended it for a very, very long time. I walked behind an empty chair, resting my hands lightly on the polished wood. I looked at Katerina. I understood it last year, Katerina, when you told your daughters my parents were uncultured swine because they live in a middle-class suburb. I said in perfect Greek, my voice as calm and steady as a metronome. I understood it 2 years ago when Eleni called me a bland American peasant. And I understood it every single week when my own husband sat at this table, eating the food my paycheck helped buy, and laughed while you tore my character to shreds. Katerina's chest heaved. For a woman who was never without a sharp, venomous reply, she was entirely paralyzed. The arrogance that shielded her had been instantly vaporized by the sheer, terrifying realization that there had never been a language barrier. She had not been mocking a blind woman, she had been confessing her cruelty directly into a microphone. Kostas, however, was a man driven by financial panic, not shame. The reality of my linguistic abilities took a secondary place to the catastrophic business problem he was facing. Lucas, Kostas hissed in English, his greasy face glistening with sweat. If she speaks Greek. If she has been listening. Yes, Kostas, I interrupted, snapping my gaze to the real estate developer, switching to English to accommodate his panic. Let us talk about the zoning board. Let us talk about the downtown high-rise project. And let us talk about the $250,000 you needed by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Lucas gripped the edge of the table and stood up. His legs were shaking so violently that his knees hit the wood. Maya, listen to me. You do not understand. It was an investment. It was just a temporary loan for the family business. I was going to put the money back before tax season. I swear to God, I was going to put it back. I looked at the man I had married. I looked at the pathetic, cowardly, treacherous shell of a human being who had tried to rob me to appease his mother. You do not have a family business, Lucas, I said softly, my voice devoid of any pity. You have a criminal conspiracy, and you are a spectacularly sloppy thief. I slowly paced across the length of the room, controlling the physical space entirely. You did not trigger a federal algorithm, I announced to the room, addressing Lucas but ensuring Katerina heard every word. The Internal Revenue Service did not flag your transaction. I flagged your transaction. Lucas's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Me, I confirmed, stopping at the head of the table near Katerina. When you are a senior cryptanalyst for a cybersecurity firm and your husband loudly announces the routing numbers for a Cayman Islands shell company over a plate of roasted potatoes, you do not wait for him to commit the felony. You set a digital tripwire on the joint account. I looked at my watch. It was 7:45 in the evening. At exactly 15 minutes past 11 on Thursday morning, I explained, delivering the payload I had been holding for 3 days, I sat in the high-rise office of my corporate litigation attorney. We watched the alert come through the moment you hit transfer. We took the digital logs, matched them with the prenuptial agreement, and walked them directly to a family court judge. Eleni let out a sudden, hysterical sob. Kostas sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands, realizing that his high-rise project was dead, and he was headed for a massive criminal investigation. Your accounts are not frozen because of a banking error, Lucas, I told him, looking dead into his eyes. They are frozen because I was granted an emergency ex parte injunction. Every single dime you own, your checking accounts, your architectural firm's operating accounts, your credit cards, is legally locked. The $250,000 is sitting in a fraud escrow. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. You cannot do this, Katerina suddenly shrieked in Greek, her shock finally giving way to desperate, raging fury. She stood up, slamming her fists onto the table, sending a wine glass tipping over. The red liquid bled across the white linen tablecloth. You are his wife. That money belongs to the family. I will hire the best lawyers in the city. I will destroy you, you American parasite. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the matriarch of the family and smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. "You will not hire anyone, Katerina," I replied in Greek, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Because lawyers cost money. And by the time my legal team is finished piercing the corporate veil of Kostas's development firm for attempting to launder stolen marital assets, you will be leveraging this very house just to keep your son and your son-in-law out of federal prison." I turned toward the grand foyer. "Right on time," I said quietly. When I had entered the house 10 minutes earlier, I had intentionally left the heavy oak front doors unlatched. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed on the marble flooring of the entryway. Two tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark suits walked seamlessly into the dining room. They carried thick, heavy stacks of manila folders. They were Evelyn's elite private process servers. The room fell into an absolute, breathless silence once again as the two men fanned out. The first server walked directly to Lucas. He handed him a thick envelope. "Lucas, you have been served," the man stated flatly. The second server walked to Kostas, handing him a separate, equally thick envelope. "Kostas, you have been served." Lucas's hands were shaking so terribly he could barely tear open the flap. He pulled out the documents. "What is this?" Katerina demanded, her voice shrill and panicked, grabbing Lucas's arm. "Lucas, what does it say?" "It is a petition for absolute divorce," I answered for him, standing near the archway, adjusting my trench coat over my arm. "Citing irreconcilable differences, financial fraud, and dissipation of marital assets." The second packet, which Kostas is currently reading, is a formal notice of a civil lawsuit naming his development firm as a complicit entity in attempted money laundering. Kostas dropped the papers onto his plate of lamb. He looked like he was going to vomit. Lucas stared at the divorce petition. He looked up at me, tears spilling over his eyelashes, streaming down his cheeks. The golden son, the man who had mocked me to secure his place at this table, was reduced to a weeping, ruined mess. "Maya, please," Lucas begged, his voice cracking, stepping toward me. "Please, I am sorry, I was stupid. My mother pressured me. You know she controls everything. Please, I love you. Do not throw our marriage away over one mistake." In my profession, when a hostile entity realizes their encryption has been broken, they always try to renegotiate the terms of their surrender. They beg for mercy they never intended to show you. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The love I had once held for him had been systematically dismantled, week by week, word by word, in this very room. "It was not one mistake, Lucas," I said quietly, speaking English for the final time. "It was 3 years of mistakes. You made your choice every single Sunday. You chose to sit at this table and treat me like a joke. Well, the joke is over, and I am the one walking away with the punchline." I did not wait for his reply. I turned my back on the grand dining room. I did not look at Katerina, who was screaming something in Greek at Kostas. I did not look at Eleni, who was crying into her napkin. I walked out of the heavy oak doors, stepped into the cold, cleansing rain, and drove back to the city. The aftermath of that Sunday dinner was a masterpiece of legal and financial obliteration. When you introduce documented evidence of wire fraud and asset concealment into a divorce proceeding, the offending spouse loses all presumption of equity. My lawyer, Evelyn, operated with the ruthless precision of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. Because Lucas had attempted to steal my premarital earnings and hide them offshore, the judge stripped him of any claim to our remaining joint assets. I recovered every single dime of my money. The bank formally released the frozen $250,000 back into an account solely in my name. Lucas was left with nothing but the debts of his architectural firm, which quickly spiraled out of control without my income to subsidize his lifestyle. But the true devastation fell upon Kostas and Katerina. Kostas missed the deadline for the zoning board's environmental impact fee. Without the stolen $250,000, the city pulled the permits for his downtown high-rise project. His investors, furious at the sudden collapse, initiated a forensic audit of his development firm. The audit uncovered a massive web of misappropriated funds and shady accounting practices. Kostas was forced to file for corporate bankruptcy to avoid federal prosecution. He lost his business, his reputation, and the respect of the local real estate community. Katerina, desperate to save her golden son and her disgraced son-in-law, attempted to bail them out using her own vast fortune. But saving 2 collapsing businesses and funding, high-end defense attorneys drains a fortune rapidly. She was forced to quietly sell two of her prized commercial properties at a massive loss just to keep her family out of court. The matriarch who had sat at the head of her oak table, demanding absolute loyalty and mocking anyone who did not speak her language, was humbled entirely. Her empire was fractured, and her family was a public embarrassment. Last I heard through the legal grapevine, Lucas was living in the basement of Katerina's estate, working as a low-level draftsman for a rival architectural firm, spending half his paycheck on alimony to a previous ex-wife he had neglected to tell me about. The grand, boisterous Sunday dinners had ceased entirely, replaced by the bitter, resentful silence of people trapped in a prison of their own making. As for me, I thrived. I took the money I recovered from the joint account and purchased a beautiful, modern loft in the heart of the city, overlooking the skyline. I was promoted to the director of my division at the cybersecurity firm. I surrounded myself with friends who communicated honestly, colleagues who respected my intellect, and a life entirely devoid of hidden agendas. And occasionally, I take vacations to Greece. It is a remarkably beautiful country when you are not forced to experience it through the lens of a toxic family. I order my coffee, I navigate the historical sites, and I converse with the locals in absolutely flawless Greek. People who hear my story often ask me how I managed to keep my composure for 3 entire years. They ask how I did not simply stand up, flip my plate over, and scream at them the very first time I understood an insult. I tell them the same thing I tell my junior cryptanalysts on their first day of training. When you discover that someone is speaking in a code designed to exclude you, your first instinct is anger. You want to confront them. You want to demand they speak a language you understand. But forcing a liar to speak your language does not make them honest. It just makes them more careful with their lies. If you truly want to destroy a hostile network, you do not force them to change their code. You quietly learn it. You sit in the dark, you gather the data, and you let them grow arrogant. You let them believe they are the smartest people in the room, right up until the exact moment you use their own words to detonate the foundation of their entire life. Silence is not weakness. Silence is a collection mechanism, and when applied correctly, it is the most lethal weapon in the world. That is my story. If you are listening to this, and you are currently dealing with a partner who isolates you, a family that treats you like an outsider, or an environment where you are deliberately kept in the dark, do not panic. Do not beg for inclusion. Just sit back. Start paying attention to the patterns. Learn the language of their deception. Build your exit strategy in absolute silence, and wait for the perfect Sunday dinner to deliver the translation. If you have ever played the long game against a toxic family, or if you believe in the absolute, undeniable power of learning a second language, type the word decrypted in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for tuning in to Family Drama Files. Remember, your intelligence is not negotiable, and your peace is a premium asset. Protect it fiercely. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.